The clay is cool against your fingers. Not cold, cool. The kind of temperature that tells you this object has been waiting in darkness for a very long time. You're standing in a basement storage facility at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the curator has just handed you a fragment no larger than your palm. Kassite period, she says. 16th century BC, give or take. The tablet is dense, heavier than it looks, inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that seem to press into the clay with deliberate authority. The text is a dedication, not to a king, not to a city, to Enlil, specifically to his temple, the Eker, the mountain house, in the ancient city of Nippur. And here is where something shifts in the room, though nothing has moved. Because Enlil is not simply another name in the crowded pantheon of Mesopotamian deities. He was not the creator god. That was his father An, god of heaven. He was not the shaper of humanity. That was Enki, the clever god of water and wisdom. Enlil was something else. The Sumerians called him the decreer of fates, the one whose command could not be altered, the executive authority of the cosmos. And every king who ever ruled in Mesopotamia, from the earliest Sumerian city-states through the Akkadian Empire, the Ur-3 dynasty, into Babylonian and Assyrian periods, claimed their right to rule from one source, Enlil's selection, chosen by Enlil in his heart for shepherdship of the land. That phrase, or variations of it, appears across thousands of years of cuneiform texts. It is the foundational claim of legitimate authority in one of history's longest lasting civilizations. But here is what the tablet in your hand does not say. It does not explain why that particular formulation, divine selection, executive decree, hierarchical administration, became the template. It does not tell you where the system came from. It simply assumes you already know how authority works. It assumes the structure is permanent, natural, the way things have always been. Now set the tablet down gently. Step back. Consider what you are looking at. This is not mythology in the sense of stories invented to explain thunder or the changing seasons. This is administrative theology, a cosmology that describes how decisions are made, how power is transferred, how order is maintained. The Sumerians built a civilization that lasted over 3,000 years, and at its centre was a model of governance so sophisticated, so carefully articulated, that its basic architecture is still recognisable today. Enlil sat at the top. The divine assembly, the Anunnaki, the seven who decree, convened to make decisions. Fates were recorded, decrees were issued. Authority flowed downward through clear chains of command. Kings ruled by mandate. Bureaucrats kept meticulous records. Laws were written and enforced. Order was maintained. Does that sound familiar? Because here is the question that this tablet raises, sitting quietly in your hand with its cuneiform dedication to a god whose temple has been dust for millennia. What if the organisational structures we assume are modern inventions, representative councils, executive authority, written law, bureaucratic hierarchy, the very concept of legitimate power requiring higher sanction? What if those patterns are not inventions at all? What if they are memories? What if Enlil, the Anunnaki commander who decreed the fates of gods and men from his throne in Nippur, established a system so effective, so deeply embedded in human civilization, that we are still operating within its framework without recognizing the hand that built it? The texts say his word was unchangeable, that his command established cosmic order, that kingship itself flowed from his temple in Nippur like water from a spring, not created there, but emerging from a deeper source. And if you listen carefully to the tablets, not to what they claim, but to what they assume you already know, they suggest something that makes scholars uncomfortable. They suggest that the Sumerians were not inventing civilization. They were restoring it, reconstructing something that had existed before, preserving knowledge that had survived some great interruption. The flood, they called it, the time when kingship was carried away. And then, after the waters receded, kingship descended once again from heaven. From where? The texts do not say, they simply record that it returned. That order was re-established. That Enlil, who had decreed the flood, also decreed the restoration. Outside this museum, in the world you will return to when you set this tablet down, there are hierarchies, governments, executives who decree, assemblies that deliberate, laws that are written and enforced, authority that flows from higher sources, constitutions, mandates, divine right repackaged as popular sovereignty, systems that feel permanent, natural, the way things have always been. But they have not always been. There was a time before them, and if the Sumerian texts are to be believed not as mythology, but as the records they claim to be, there was also a time before that time, an earlier order, a prior system, and Enlil was not its inventor, he was its administrator. Before we go further, before we descend into the question of what this means and whether it is even possible, I want to know something. I want to know where you are as you hear this. What city, what country, what quiet corner of the world you have found to contemplate the impossible. Drop a comment, just your location, nothing more. Listening from, let me know where this question is reaching you, because the answer may be different depending on where you stand in the hierarchies that structure your life. The tablet goes back into its archival box. The curator seals it away. But the question it raised does not seal so easily, because somewhere beneath the dust of Nippur, beneath the remains of the Echo Temple where Enlil's authority was once absolute, there are foundations, older foundations, layers that go down farther than the Sumerian period, down into the Ubaid culture, down into the ceramic Neolithic, down into periods for which we have no names and no texts. And if you were to dig there, carefully, methodically, the way archaeologists do, you would find that the architecture does not become simpler as you go deeper. It becomes more sophisticated, as if what the Sumerians built on the surface was not the beginning of something, but the continuation, the restoration, the best approximation they could manage of something they remembered but could no longer fully recreate. This is the story of Enlil, not as myth, but as system, not as God, but as organisational principle, not as ancient superstition, but as the blueprint that may still govern how power moves through the world you inhabit. And if that sounds impossible, consider this. You have never questioned why authority works the way it does, why leaders must be chosen, why laws must be written, why hierarchies must be maintained. You accept these structures as natural, inevitable, the only way complex societies can function. But they are not natural, they are design. And the question the Sumerians leave us, the question this tablet holds in its dense clay silence, is whether that design is ours, or whether we inherited it from hands we have forgotten, from a commander whose decrees we still follow, whose system we still inhabit, whose influence persists not through belief, but through structure, through the bones of how we organise everything. Let us examine those bones, the mountain house and the breath of authority. In the Sumerian language, his name was written with two cuneiform signs, N and L. N means Lord. That part is straightforward. But Lel is where translation becomes interpretation, where the academic consensus fractures into competing theories, and where something important hides in the ambiguity. Some scholars translate Lel as wind or air, making Enlil the Lord of Wind, a storm deity whose breath moved across the primordial waters. Others read Lel as ghost or phantom, suggesting something less physical, a presence, a force that cannot be seen but whose effects are undeniable. Still others, examining the earliest contexts in which the name appears, propose that El referred to something like atmosphere or space, not empty void, but the medium through which things move and act, the layer between heaven and earth where authority descends and where commands travel. What matters is not which translation is correct. What matters is that all of them describe the same essential function Enlil was the medium of transmission, the layer through which divine will become manifest action. He was not the source of power. That was his father An, the sky god, the distant ultimate authority. Enlil was the executive, the enforcer, the one who took abstract cosmic law and made it operational. The texts are consistent on this point, even when they differ on others. The Kesh temple hymn, one of the oldest pieces of Sumerian literature we possess, calls Enlil the great god, king of the lands. But notice what follows. Not that he created the lands, but that he establishes their boundaries. Not that he made humanity, but that he assigns roles and destinies. His epithets across thousands of texts are administrative, decreer of fates, establisher of abundance, exalted judge, shepherd of the black-headed people. These are managerial titles. In the Old Babylonian period hymn to Enlil, preserved on tablet CBS 14152 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the text describes his temple in Nippur, the Eker, the mountain house, in terms that should sound familiar to anyone who has stood before a seat of government. The hymn speaks of how Enlil's word is weighty in heaven and earth, how his command is unchangeable, how kings receive their authority not through conquest or strength, but through his selection. The text uses a specific phrase, namlugal, meaning kingship as a concept, not any particular king, but the abstract principle of royal authority itself. And that principle, the hymn states clearly, belongs to Enlil. He distributes it, he can revoke it. It flows from his temple like water from an irrigation channel. But where did it flow from before that? The question hangs in the air, the L, if you will, between what the texts say and what they assume. Because here is what the Sumerian material never explains. How Enlil came to hold this position. The creation myths that survive, Enki and Ninmah, the Song of the Hoe, even the later Babylonian Enuma Elish, do not describe Enlil seizing power or earning it through some great act. He simply has it. The organisational structure of the cosmos is already established when the narratives begin. An is in heaven, distant and mostly inactive. Enki is in the Abzu, the freshwater deep, working on the mechanics of life and cleverness. And Enlil is in Nippur, in the Eker, where authority is exercised. The system is already running. This should bother us more than it does. When later cultures tell origin stories of their gods, there is usually conflict. Zeus overthrows Cronus. Marduk defeats Tiamat. Power is contested, seized, justified through victory. But in the earliest Sumerian material, Enlil's authority is presented as structural, not one, but inherent, not mythological, but constitutional. He is the executive because that is the office he holds. In one text, his father An is described as speaking to the assembled gods, Enlil shall be my executive. He shall hold the seal of decision. His word shall be supreme. The phrasing is legal, not narrative. It reads less like a myth of succession and more like a charter, a delegation of powers, an organisational document. And this brings us to the geography. Nippur, the city where Enlil's temple stood, was never the largest Sumerian city. It was never the wealthiest or the most militarily powerful. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, these cities rose and fell in cycles of dominance. But Nippur remained constant. It was the religious centre, yes, but more precisely, it was the administrative centre, the place where legitimacy was conferred. Every king, no matter how powerful, no matter which city they ruled from, made pilgrimage to Nippur. They rebuilt Enlil's temple. They left dedicatory inscriptions. They claimed his sanction, because without it, their rule was not legitimate. This is not how mythology typically works. Myths explain natural phenomena, why there are seasons, why snakes shed their skin, why storms happen. But this is not that. This is political structure. This is the articulation of a system that requires a specific city, a specific temple, a specific deity to authorise temporal power. That is not folklore. That is constitution. The Eker itself is worth examining. Archaeologists excavating at Nippur since the late 19th century have found layer after layer of temple construction. Each time the city was destroyed or declined, whoever rebuilt it began with the Ika, not the palace, not the granaries, the temple. And each rebuilding followed the same basic plan: a central courtyard, a raised platform, a sanctuary where the Tablet of Destinies was supposedly kept. The architecture is repetitive across centuries because the function demanded consistency. This was not a place of worship in the devotional sense. It was a place of administration, of recording, of decreeing. Miguel Civil, the scholar who published one of the authoritative editions of Enlil texts, noted something peculiar in the hymns. They describe Enlil's temple not primarily in terms of beauty or grandeur, but in terms of efficacy. The acre is praised because judgments are made there, because fates are decreed there, because abundance is distributed from there. These are operational statements. The temple functions. It produces outputs, decisions, decrees, distributions from inputs that the texts do not fully describe. What were those inputs? If we take the texts at their word, not as poetry, but as procedural description, Enlil received reports. From whom? The texts mention watchers, messengers, the 7 who decree. He consulted with other members of the divine assembly. He examined situations. And then he issued commands that were recorded on the Tablet of Destinies, a physical object that multiple myths describe in detail. This is administrative behaviour. Now, the conventional reading treats all of this as anthropomorphism. Humans project their own political structures onto divine figures. We create gods who act like kings because we understand kings. The psychology is comforting and probably true for many deities across many cultures. But Enlil presents a problem for this explanation. Because the Sumerian political structure does not resemble Enlil's cosmological role, it inverts it. Sumerian city-states were ruled by assemblies of elders with a lugal, a big man, a temporary military leader, elevated during crises. There was no permanent supreme executive in early Sumerian governance. Power was distributed, contested, negotiated, yet their cosmology places a permanent supreme executive at its centre. If they were projecting their politics onto their gods, why did they project a system they did not use? The alternative reading, the one that makes scholars nervous, is that the causation runs the other direction. That Sumerian political structure was an imperfect attempt to implement a cosmological model they believed was correct. That they knew centralized executive authority was the proper form of governance, because Enlil's administration demonstrated it, but they could not maintain it at the human level. Not yet. Not until later periods, when kingship became permanent and centralized bureaucracy developed, in which case Enlil's organizational model was not derived from human experience. It preceded it. The hymn to Enlil describes his presence in terms that emphasize his operational function. When Enlil sits on his holy throne, when he exercises supremely the divine powers, the gods of the earth bow down themselves, the gods of heaven prostrate themselves. This is hierarchy, explicit, structured, unambiguous. There is a chain of command. There are subordinate gods, the Anunnaki, who answer to Enlil, and there is Enlil, who holds what the text calls the divine powers, the me. We will return to the me later, because they are critical. For now, understand them as something like operational authorities, specific domains of power and function that could be held, transferred, or lost. Kingship was a me. So was priesthood, warfare, writing, music, metalworking, law. The me were not metaphorical. The texts treat them as discrete, quantifiable powers that Enlil controlled and distributed. This is not animism. This is not even polytheism in the usual sense. This is org chart theology. And Enlil sat at the top of the chart not because he was the most powerful in raw strength, Several texts make clear that Enki was more clever, that An was more ultimate in authority, that later gods like Marduk could defeat him in combat. Enlil's supremacy was positional. He held the executive office. He controlled the distribution of the me. He possessed the tablet of destinies, which meant he could decree what would happen. And in the Sumerian cosmos, decrees that were properly issued from proper authority became reality, not through force, but through systemic compliance. The gods obeyed Enlil not because they feared him, but because the system required obedience to properly issued commands. And when Enlil issued a decree, when he spoke it, had it recorded, sealed it with his authority, it became part of what we might call the code of reality. It ran. This is the part that should unsettle you if you are paying attention, because what the Sumerians are describing is not supernatural. It is procedural. Authority functions through correct process. Commands issued from the proper office, through the proper channels, recorded in the proper format, become binding. This is not magic. This is bureaucracy. And the Sumerians articulated it 4,000 years before Weber described the iron cage of rationalized administration. Where did they get this model? The texts do not say. They describe it, elaborate it, embed it in narrative, but they never explain its origin. It is simply there, at the foundation. Enlil is the executive. His word is law. The system runs. And humanity, the texts say, was created to serve the gods, meaning in procedural terms, to operate within this system, to fulfill the roles decreed by it, to maintain the cosmic order it established. Enlil's epithets reinforce this again and again. He is the great mountain, not a poetic metaphor for strength, but a reference to the cosmic mountain, the axis mundi, the structural pillar of the universe. He is Nunamnir, a name whose meaning is disputed, but which seems to involve princely authority and decisive action. He is the king of heaven and earth, not because he created them, but because he governs the space between them. The El, the atmosphere of authority itself. In one particularly revealing passage from a Sumerian disputation text, two scribes are arguing about whose patron god is superior. One serves Enlil, the other serves Enki. The Enki scribe lists his god's accomplishments, wisdom, magic, the creation of humanity, the gift of arts and crafts. The Enlil scribe's response is telling. He does not list accomplishments. He states a single fact. Enlil's command is far-reaching, his word is holy, what he has spoken is unalterable, he decrees fates into the distant future. That is the argument. Not what Enlil has done, but the nature of his authority. His word is binding. He does not need to be clever or creative. He issues the decree, and it becomes real. This is executive power in its purest form. And if we trace that concept forward through history, the idea that legitimate authority can issue binding commands, not through force, but through correct procedure, we find it everywhere. In Hammurabi's code, where law flows from divine sanction, in Persian imperial administration, where the king's word was unalterable once sealed, in Roman legal theory, where the emperor's will had force of law, in medieval divine right, in constitutional governance, where properly enacted law binds even those who opposed it. The shape is consistent, the structure is recognizable, and at the root, in the earliest articulation we can find, there is Enlil in the Eka, decreeing fates, distributing the me, maintaining the system. Was he a god? The Sumerians certainly thought so. But what they meant by god may not be what we mean. The Sumerian term dingir, which we translate as god, seems to have meant something closer to functional power or authoritative office holder. It was applied to deities, to kings, to deified concepts. It marked not supernatural nature, but structural position within the cosmic hierarchy, in which case Enlil the Dingir was not a supernatural being who happened to hold authority. He was the authority itself, personified, operational, exercising executive function within a system that the Sumerians understood themselves to be inside of, not subject to in the sense of tyranny, but participant within in the sense of organisational structure. You live inside a system now. You have authorities above you, governmental, corporate, institutional. They issue directives. You comply, or you face consequences. The system runs, and you accept this as natural because you were born into it, raised within it, trained to understand that this is how complex societies function. But someone designed that system. Someone articulated the principle that legitimate authority can compel compliance through correct procedure. Someone established that the written law, the official decree, the executive order, carries force not through violence, but through systemic recognition. The Sumerians credit Enlil, and they do not describe him as inventing it. They describe him as operating it, as holding the office, as executing the functions that maintain cosmic order, which raises the question that will structure everything that follows. If Enlil was operating a system rather than creating one, where did the system come from? Who designed the Akor's function before the first brick was laid in Nippur? What prior order was being restored when kingship descended from heaven after the flood? The texts speak of the distant days, the olden times, the period before the cities. They speak of it not with the vagueness of myth, but with the specificity of history. They name places, they give measurements, they describe events in procedural detail, as if they are consulting records, as if they are remembering. And Enlil, the great administrator, the supreme executive, the decreer of fates, sits at his throne in the mountain house, not as a character in a story, but as a function in a system that was already running when the story began. His authority was weighty in heaven and earth, the texts say, not because he seized it, but because the system required someone to hold that office. And he held it. The tablet that commands existence. There is an object in Sumerian cosmology that appears again and again in texts, separated by centuries and geography. It is called the Tablet of Destinies, in Akkadian, the Up-MTI. It is not a metaphor. Every time it appears, the texts describe it as a physical object with specific properties. It is held, stored, stolen, recovered. It grants its possessor the ability to decree the fates of gods and mortals. And most importantly, it is the mechanism through which divine authority becomes operational. This is worth pausing on, because we do not have many artifacts from ancient civilizations described with this level of procedural detail unless they actually existed. The most complete narrative involving the tablet appears in the myth of Anzu, a lion-headed eagle creature who served as doorkeeper at Enlil's temple in Nippur. The story, preserved on tablets from the old Babylonian through Near-Assyrian periods, begins not with chaos or conflict, but with procedure. Enlil is taking a ritual bath in the sacred waters of the temple precinct. The Tablet of Destinies has been removed from his presence and placed in the inner chamber, and Anzu, who has been observing the operations of divine government, sees an opportunity. The text is explicit about what happens next. He conceived the idea of taking the divine functions. He waited for the start of day, and when Enlil was bathing in holy water, stripped and his diadem laid down on the throne, seized the Tablet of Destinies in his hands and flew off. Notice the operational details. Enlil has removed his diadem, the physical symbol of executive authority. The tablet is accessible during this ritual moment. Anzu does not attack Enlil. He does not defeat him in combat. He takes advantage of a procedural gap, a moment when the security protocols of divine governance are temporarily relaxed. This reads like an administrative breach, not a mythological battle. What happens next is even more revealing. With the Tablet of Destinies in his possession, Anzu flies to the mountains and immediately begins issuing decrees. The text says he changed the formulas. The other gods find that their commands no longer function. The cosmic order stalls, not because Enlil has been defeated, he is unharmed, but because the mechanism of authority has been taken. The proper procedures can no longer be executed. The system has locked. This is not magic. This is a description of what happens when authentication credentials are stolen from a secured system. Enlil calls an assembly of the gods. The text uses the formal term puhru, a council meeting, a deliberative body convened to address a crisis. And here is where the narrative structure becomes interesting, because what follows is not Enlil taking action himself. He cannot. Without the tablet, his authority is inoperative. Instead, he must request that another god volunteer to retrieve it. Several gods refuse. The text makes clear why whoever confronts Anzu will be facing someone who holds the tablet, someone who can issue binding decrees, someone who now possesses the executive function. Finally, Ninurta, Enlil's son, the warrior god associated with storms and military prowess, accepts the task. But even then, he cannot succeed through strength alone. The myth describes multiple failed attempts. Ninurta shoots arrows at Anzu. Anzu uses the tablet to decree that the arrows fall harmlessly. Ninurta calls storms. Anzu decrees them dispersed. As long as Anzu holds the tablet, his commands override Ninurta's actions. The resolution comes not through greater force, but through procedural knowledge. Enki, the god of wisdom, devises a strategy. He instructs Ninurta to target not Anzu himself, but the feathers of his wings, specifically the primary flight feathers. If those are severed, Anzu will lose control of his flight, lose his grip on the tablet, and the authority it confers will become uncoupled from its illegitimate holder. The plan works. Ninurta severs the feathers. Anzu falls. The tablet is recovered. And, this is critical, Ninurta does not keep it. He immediately returns it to Enlil. Because the tablet's power is not intrinsic to whoever holds it, its power is procedural. It functions only when held by the legitimate executive authority. Enlil's possession of the tablet does not grant him authority. His authority is what makes the tablet functional. This distinction matters, because what the myth is describing is not magical thinking. It is the concept that authority requires both positional legitimacy and procedural mechanism. You need the right to issue commands and the means to make those commands binding the tablet. Remove either one and the system fails. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets at the British Museum, the Tablet of Destinies plays a similar role. When the primordial goddess, Tiamat, rebels against the younger gods, she creates an army of monsters and appoints Kingu as their commander. And to grant him the authority to lead, she gives him the Tablet of Destinies and fastens it upon his chest. The text describes this as the conferral of executive power. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies and fastened it to his breast. Your utterance shall never be altered. Again, the operational principle, possession of the tablet, makes commands unalterable. It binds reality to conform to the decree. And again, when Marduk defeats Kingu, the first thing he does, before even finishing the battle against Tiamat, is to take the tablet from Kingu's breast and fasten it upon his own. The transfer of the mechanism precedes the exercise of new authority. Marduk then uses the tablet to reorganize the cosmos. He decrees the positions of stars, the cycles of seasons, the duties of the gods. He issues these decrees, they are recorded, and they become the operating parameters of the universe. This is cosmological administration. The universe functions according to decrees issued by proper authority through proper mechanism. Now, the conventional scholarly reading treats the Tablet of Destinies as a mythological symbol for the concept of fate or divine will. And that is certainly part of what it represents. But the texts never treat it as merely symbolic. They describe it with the kind of procedural specificity reserved for objects that actually existed in some form. Consider the details. The tablet is kept in the inner chamber of the echo. It is guarded. It can be physically moved. It must be properly secured. When stolen, the entire system of cosmic governance becomes inoperative until it is recovered. These are not the characteristics of an abstract concept. These are the characteristics of a critical infrastructure component. What might it have been? If we take the texts at face value, not as poetry, but as description, the Tablet of Destinies appears to have been a physical object on which decrees were recorded. Cuneiform tablets were the primary medium of record-keeping in Mesopotamia. Administrative tablets documenting everything from grain allotments to legal contracts have been found by the hundreds of thousands. The Sumerians and Akkadians understood that written records were binding. A contract tablet sealed with the proper authorities could compel action. A royal decree inscribed and sealed became law. The Tablet of Destinies, in this reading, would be the master record, the constitutional document, the tablet on which the fundamental operating principles of cosmic order were inscribed, and possession of it, legitimate possession, by the properly authorized executive, granted the ability to add to that record, to issue new decrees that became part of the code, to modify the parameters of reality according to proper procedure. This seems like a leap. How could a clay tablet modify reality? But we do this now. We have documents that modify reality through systemic compliance, constitutional amendments, executive orders, judicial rulings. These are not enforced through physical power. They are enforced through coordinated recognition within a system. Everyone agrees that properly issued law is binding, and so it becomes binding. The system runs. The Sumerians described the same principle, but at a cosmic scale. The Tablet of Destinies was the mechanism through which properly authorized decrees became cosmically binding, not through magic, but through systemic compliance by all participants in the cosmic order, gods included. The Anzu myth even describes what happens when someone holds a tablet without proper authorization. The system recognizes their commands, but the other gods recognize the illegitimacy. A crisis of legitimacy emerges, and the resolution comes not through destroying the mechanism, the tablet, but through restoring it to the legitimate office holder. In our terms, the system has been hacked. The authentication credentials have been stolen. Normal operations are suspended until security is restored. And restoration means not just retrieving the tablet, but ensuring it is returned to the proper authority within the proper procedural framework. This is remarkably sophisticated organizational thinking for texts dated to the 2nd millennium BCE, or rather, it would be sophisticated if the Sumerians were inventing these concepts. But the texts never claim invention. They describe the Tablet of Destinies as something that already existed. Enlil already possessed it. The system was already operational. The myths tell us how it was threatened and restored, but they do not tell us how it was created or where it came from. There is a text fragment, a single tablet from the Old Babylonian period, housed at the University of Pennsylvania, catalogue number CBS 1673, that describes the Tablet of Destinies in terms that suggest it predated even the current cosmic order. The fragment is damaged, but the surviving lines read, "In the distant days, in the far-off days, in the old days when, the Tablet of Destinies was established, before the heavens were named, before the firm ground was called by name, the divine ME were distributed." The grammar indicates sequence. First the tablet was established, then heaven and earth were named, then the divine ME, the powers and functions that organize reality, were distributed. The tablet precedes the current order. It is the foundational mechanism from which everything else derives. If this is accurate, if the Tablet of Destinies represents some kind of constitutional document or operational protocol that predated the organized cosmos, then we are looking at something very different from mythology. We are looking at a description of systematic organization, of governance infrastructure, of a designed order. And Enlil's possession of the tablet is not arbitrary. He holds it because he holds the executive office. The tablet functions because the system recognizes his authority. His authority is meaningful because the tablet provides the mechanism through which his decrees become operative. It is a closed loop, a self-reinforcing system, and it was, according to the texts, already running when the narratives begin. The question, again, who designed it? The Sumerians did not claim to have designed it. They claimed to have inherited it, to have restored it after the flood, to have rebuilt the Eker in Nippur according to the pattern that had existed before, to have re-established the system of divine governance that had operated in the olden times. And at the centre of that system was this object, physical or conceptual, actual or symbolic, but always described with procedural precision, that transformed properly issued commands into binding reality. We have equivalent mechanisms now. We call them constitutions, legal codes, authorized databases, authenticated systems. We understand that authority must be both legitimate and procedurally exercised. We accept that written, properly authenticated directives can compel compliance across vast organizational structures without the use of force. We live inside a system that recognizes these principles. The Sumerians described themselves as living inside a system that recognized these principles, and they attributed the design of that system not to human invention, but to divine order, to Enlil's governance, to the operational function of the Tablet of Destinies. Whether the tablet was a literal clay tablet inscribed with cosmic law, or a conceptual framework for understanding how authority functions, or something else entirely, the principle it embodies is consistent. Order requires mechanism, authority requires procedure, and commands issued through proper channels by proper authorities using proper mechanisms become binding on all participants in the system. That is not mythology. That is organizational architecture. And it was fully articulated, completely operational in texts from 4,000 years ago. Where did the Sumerians learn this? The texts do not say. They simply describe it. They assume you understand how it works. They take for granted that their audience already knows that authority functions through procedural mechanism, that cosmic order is maintained through executive decree, that reality itself responds to properly issued commands, as if everyone already knew, as if it had always been this way, as if the system had always been running, even when the cities fell, even when the flood came, even when kingship was carried away, and then descended once again from heaven. The tablet remained, the office remained, the system remained. And Enlil held his position not through strength or creation, but through the simple fact that someone needed to execute the functions, and he was authorized to do so. The mechanism required an operator. He was the operator. And according to the myths, when unauthorized hands seized the mechanism, the entire cosmic order stalled until proper authority was restored. Consider what that implies about the nature of the system itself. It is not powered by divine magic. It is powered by procedural legitimacy. Break the chain of authority, and even the gods cannot function. Restore the chain, and order resumes. That is not how we think gods work, but it is exactly how we know organizations work. And the Sumerians described their cosmos as an organization, with Enlil as the chief executive and the Tablet of Destinies as the constitutional mechanism through which his authority became operative. 4,000 years ago they articulated this, or rather 4,000 years ago they recorded this, because they did not claim to have invented it, they claimed to have inherited it from a time before, from the olden days, from the period when order was first established and the system first ran. And if they inherited it, someone else designed it, someone whose name the texts do not preserve, or whose identity has been encoded into the figure of Enlil himself, not as a supernatural being, but as the executive function personified, the administrator, the one who decrees the fates not through whim but through proper procedure, the one who holds the tablet and whose commands, properly issued, become the structure of reality itself. When gods convened the divine assembly, Enlil did not govern alone. The texts are clear on this point. He presided over a council, a formal assembly of deities called the Anunnaki, or in some contexts, the Igigi. And while Enlil's executive authority was supreme, the assembly served a critical function, deliberation, consultation, and collective decision making on matters that would affect cosmic order. This is not the divine council of later monotheistic tradition, where subordinate angels exist only to execute the will of an omnipotent deity. This is a governing council with deliberative power, procedural rules, and functional roles distributed among its members. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on multiple tablets from the Old Babylonian period, the most complete of which is British Museum Tablet BM 78941, contains one of the most detailed descriptions of the divine assembly in operation. The setting is critical, humanity has been created and has begun to multiply across the earth. The noise of human activity disturbs the gods, particularly Enlil, whose sleep is disrupted. What happens next is not a unilateral decree from an angry deity. What happens is a meeting. The text describes it with procedural language. The assembly of the great gods was convened. Enlil addressed the assembly. Other gods speak in turn. Enki objects to the proposed solution. A debate ensues. This is legislative process. There are speakers, there are objections, there is deliberation. Eventually, a decision is reached, not because Enlil forces it, but because the assembly agrees. The decision, once made collectively and properly recorded, becomes binding. The decision in this case is the flood. We will examine the flood itself in the next section. For now, focus on the procedure. A problem arises in overpopulation and drought. The executive convenes the council deliberates. A decision is reached through collective process. The decision is executed. This is governance, and the text treats it as normal. This is how cosmic decisions are made, not through arbitrary divine whim, but through institutional process. The council itself has structure. The texts refer to the 7 who decree the fates, a specific subset of the Anunnaki who hold particular authority. These 7 are named in various god lists: An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu, and Inanna. Each represents a domain, heaven, wind, authority, water, wisdom, earth, birth, moon, sun, and fertility, warfare, respectively. Together they cover the fundamental aspects of cosmic function, and together they hold the authority to decree fates, not Enlil alone, the 7 together. Even though Enlil presides and his word carries the most weight, the system requires collective authorization for major decisions. This is not monarchy, this is oligarchy, ruled by a small council of equals, with one member holding primus inter pares status, first among equals. The deliberative model appears again and again across Sumerian and Akkadian texts. In the Enuma Elish, when the younger gods need someone to confront Tiamat, they convene an assembly. Marduk agrees to fight, but only on condition that the assembly grant him supreme authority if he succeeds. The gods deliberate. They agree. They formally invest Marduk with executive power, symbolized by his receiving the Tablet of Destinies after defeating Kingu. The transfer of authority happens through institutional process, with the assembly serving as the legitimizing body. Even in myths where individual gods act, they often reference the assembly's authority. When Enki decides to warn Atrahasis about the coming flood, he does so covertly, not because he cannot oppose Enlil through force, but because the assembly has reached a decision, and that decision is now part of the cosmic order. Enki finds a loophole. He speaks not to Atrahasis directly, but to the wall of his house, knowing Atrahasis will overhear. This is procedural compliance. The letter of the law is observed even when the spirit is subverted. This kind of legal manoeuvring appears throughout Mesopotamian texts. It suggests a culture deeply concerned with procedure, with the proper execution of authority, with the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate action based not on outcome but on process. And the divine assembly is the locus of that procedural legitimacy. Consider the parallel to human governance. The Sumerian city-states were not monarchies in their earliest forms. They had assemblies of elders, councils of prominent citizens, who deliberated on major decisions. They elevated lugals, great men, to temporary leadership during crises, but these leaders theoretically answered to the assembly. The Akkadian Empire and later Babylonian and Assyrian systems centralized power more firmly, but even then, kings consulted councils of nobles, priests, and officials. The conventional reading is that the Sumerians projected their own political structures onto the divine realm. They governed through councils, so they imagined the gods governing through councils. But again, the chronology is suggestive. The earliest Sumerian texts describing the divine assembly predate the development of sophisticated human assembly governance, and the divine model is more developed, more procedurally explicit than anything we see in early human political organization. The text describes specific gods holding specific portfolios, specific procedures for convening and conducting assembly business, specific mechanisms for recording and executing decisions. If the Sumerians were projecting their own governance onto the gods, they were projecting a system more sophisticated than what they themselves had implemented. The alternative reading, they were describing a system that had been explained to them, or that they had inherited memory of, a model of governance that predated their own attempts to organize city-states, and which they looked to as the proper form. The texts themselves suggest this. When kingship descends from heaven after the flood, it does not arise spontaneously from human innovation. It is given. It is transferred from the divine realm to the human, and with it comes the organizational model, councils, hierarchies, written law, administrative procedure. The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple copies including tablets at the Ashmolean Museum and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, is explicit about this. Before the flood, there were kings. After the flood, kingship descended once again from heaven to the city of Kish. The implication is clear. Kingship is not a human invention. It is a divine institution, temporarily suspended during the catastrophe, then restored according to the prior pattern. And if kingship descended from heaven, it brought with it the organizational framework that made kingship functional: councils, bureaucracy, written records, chains of command. The divine assembly in this reading is not a mythological construct. It is a description of the organizational model that the Sumerians understood to be the correct form of governance, a model they tried to implement at the human level with varying degrees of success, but which existed in perfect form in the cosmic realm under Enlil's administration. One text, a Sumerian wisdom composition preserved on tablets from Nippur, contains a remarkable passage. A young scribe asks his teacher how to become skilled in administration. The teacher responds, "Study the divine ME. Understand the order of the assembly. Know how decisions are made in the E-Kur. For the governance of earth mirrors the governance of heaven, and the scribe who understands the divine order can implement it among men." This is not religious devotion. This is procedural training. The teacher is telling the student that if you want to understand how to govern effectively, study the divine model, learn the organizational principles that operate in the cosmic realm, and then implement them. The assumption is that the divine model works, that it is effective, that it can be studied, learned, and replicated. This is a very different understanding of mythology than we typically bring to ancient texts. We think of myths as explanatory stories, why the sun moves, why crops grow, why death exists. But Sumerian texts about the divine assembly are not explanatory. They are instructive. They present a working model of governance that humans are meant to emulate. And at the centre of that model is Enlil, presiding over the council, ensuring that proper procedure is followed, executing the decisions that the assembly reaches. He is not a tyrant imposing his will. He is a chairman managing a deliberative process. His authority is legitimate because it operates within the framework that the assembly recognizes. When Enlil decrees the flood, he does so with assembly authorization. When he distributes kingship after the flood, he does so as executor of cosmic policy. When he grants authority to individual kings, he does so as the recognized dispenser of the ME, the divine powers that make governance possible. He is the executive within a system, and the system requires both executive authority and deliberative legitimacy. This is sophisticated political theory, and it appears fully formed in texts from the 3rd millennium BC. The question hangs in the air: who designed this system? Who first articulated the principle that authority should be distributed across a council, that major decisions should be deliberative, that even supreme executive power should operate within an institutional framework? The Sumerians do not claim credit. They describe the system, they participate in it, they try to replicate it in their own cities, but they attribute its design to the gods, to Enlil and the Anunnaki assembly, to a governing council that existed before the cities, before the flood, before the present age. And if we follow the logic of the texts, if we take them seriously not as mythology, but as description, then what they are preserving is organisational memory, a record of how governance was structured in an earlier time, a template that survived some great disruption and which the post-flood civilization was trying to restore. The divine assembly was not invented by the Sumerians, it was described by them, and described with a kind of procedural detail that suggests they were consulting something, a tradition, a teaching, a preserved record of how the system was supposed to work. Enlil presiding, the 7 who decree, deliberation, decision, execution, authority flowing through proper channels, commands issued, recorded, made binding through institutional legitimacy. This is the model, this is the template, and 4,000 years later, we still convene assemblies, we still deliberate, we still distribute authority across councils. We still require that major decisions be collectively authorized even when we have strong executives. We still operate within the basic framework that the Sumerian texts describe the gods using. Did we invent it independently, or did we inherit it? And if we inherited it, from whom? The texts say from heaven, from the divine assembly, from Enlil and the Anunnaki, who governed in the olden days and who established the order that humanity was meant to follow. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, the fact remains the organisational model exists. It functions. It has structured human civilization for millennia, and its earliest articulation appears in Sumerian texts describing the government of gods. The flood decision and executive power. The decision to destroy humanity through flood appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts: the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the flood narrative in Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and fragments of other compositions. The details vary, but the core structure is consistent. Humanity has become problematic, the divine assembly is convened, a solution is proposed, and after deliberation, the decision is made. What should interest us is not whether the flood happened, geological and archaeological questions we will leave aside, but how the texts describe the decision-making process. Because this is not divine caprice. This is executive action following institutional procedure. In the Atrahasis epic, the problem is explicitly stated: human population has grown too large and too noisy. The text reads, "The land became wide, the people became numerous, the land bellowed like wild bulls, the god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become oppressive. I cannot rest because of their uproar." This is a management problem, a resource problem. The system is experiencing overload. Enlil's first solution is not the flood. That is important. His first attempt is plague. The assembly agrees. A plague is sent, human population decreases, the problem is temporarily solved. But then humanity recovers and multiplies again. The noise returns. Second attempt, drought. Again, the assembly approves. The drought is severe. But Enki, god of water and wisdom, intervenes. He instructs humanity on how to dig deeper wells, how to find underground water sources. Humanity survives. Population recovers. The noise returns. Third attempt, famine. The assembly agrees. Food production is restricted. But again, Enki intervenes with knowledge of fishing, hunting, and alternative food sources. Humanity survives. The noise returns. By this point in the narrative, Enlil is frustrated, but what is described is not irrational rage. It is escalating intervention in a system that is not responding to corrective measures. This is problem solving through iterative attempts. Each solution is proportionate, plague, drought, famine, before the final catastrophic option is considered. When Enlil finally proposes the flood, the text describes it as a decision made in council. The assembly is convened. The proposal is put forward. And here Enki objects. He does not object on moral grounds. The texts do not frame the debate in terms of right and wrong. He objects on practical grounds. Humanity serves a function. They perform labour that the gods no longer wish to perform. If humanity is destroyed entirely, who will maintain the irrigation, work the fields, make the offerings? This is policy debate. This is a discussion of costs and benefits, of unintended consequences, of alternative solutions. But Enlil's position prevails. The assembly reaches a decision, and once the decision is made through proper institutional process, it becomes binding. Even Enki, who opposed it, is bound by the assembly's decree. He cannot openly defy it without violating the cosmic order. So he finds his loophole. The text describes Enki approaching Atrahasis' house, but he does not speak to Atrahasis directly that would violate the assembly's decision. Instead, he speaks to the wall. Wall, listen to me. Read, wall, observe all my words. Destroy your house, build a boat. Atrahasis inside the house hears. He understands. He acts. This is legal manoeuvring. This is finding a way to achieve your goal while remaining technically in compliance with the decision you opposed. Enki does not violate the letter of the decree. He does not directly warn Atrahasis, but he subverts its intent, and the text treats this as clever, not as wrong. Because what matters in the Sumerian cosmic order is not outcome, but procedure. Enki follows the procedure. He complies with the decision. He simply finds a way to mitigate its effects within the rules. This tells us something crucial about how the Sumerians understood authority. Authority is not absolute. It is bounded by procedure. Even supreme executive decisions, even assembly decrees, operate within a framework that can be navigated by those who understand the system. This is rule of law thinking. Compare this to other flood narratives. In the biblical account, God decides to flood the world, and that decision is absolute and unilateral. There is no divine council. There is no debate. God sees that humanity is wicked, regrets creating them, and acts. Noah is chosen by divine favour, not through procedural loophole. The Mesopotamian version is structurally different. It presents a system where even the gods are bound by institutional procedure, where decisions must be collectively authorised, where opposition can be expressed, alternatives proposed, and mitigation strategies implemented within the rules. This is not how mythology typically works. Myths about divine judgment are usually straightforward. The god is angry, the god punishes, the end. But the Mesopotamian flood narrative is bureaucratic. It describes a decision-making process with steps, approvals, objections, compliance, and workarounds. Why would the Sumerians describe divine action this way? The conventional answer: because they were a bureaucratic society, and they projected their administrative culture onto their gods. They dealt with complicated governance in their own cities, so they imagined the gods dealing with complicated governance in heaven. But again, the timing does not align. The earliest versions of the flood narrative predate the development of sophisticated Sumerian bureaucracy, and the divine model is more procedurally elaborate than early Sumerian governance. It includes features, formal council votes, recorded decisions, binding decrees, that appear in the divine realm before they appear in human administration. If projection were the mechanism, we would expect human institutions to develop first and then be reflected in evolving mythology. But the pattern is reversed. The divine organizational model appears first, fully formed, and human institutions develop later in imitation of it. The texts themselves support this reading. After the flood, when Enlil discovers that Atrahasis has survived, he is initially angry, not at humanity, but at Enki for subverting the assembly's decision. But Enki's defense is procedural. I did not reveal the secret of the gods. I made Atrahasis see a dream, and thus he heard the secret of the gods. This is plausible deniability. Enki technically complied. He technically did not violate the decree. Enlil cannot punish him without overstepping the rules of the system, and Enlil, as administrator of that system, is bound by it. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but with constraints, shorter lifespans, infant mortality, sterility for some women, population control through natural mechanisms rather than catastrophic intervention. This is policy adjustment. The original solution failed, one family survived. An alternative is implemented, the system adapts, and the decision is recorded, made part of the cosmic order, incorporated into the ongoing operational parameters of reality. This is exactly how institutional governance works. Problem identification, solution proposal, deliberation, decision, implementation, evaluation, adjustment. The cycle continues. The system learns. The flood narrative, read this way, is not about divine punishment for human sin. It is about system management, about what happens when a component of the system grows beyond the parameters it was designed for, about how the governing authority, the divine assembly under Enlil's leadership, responds, about the procedural constraints even executive power operates within. The Eridu Genesis, an earlier Sumerian version of the flood story, presents the same basic structure, but with additional detail about the restoration after the flood. When the waters recede, the text describes kingship descending once again from heaven, not emerging naturally from human survivors, but being granted, reinstalled, restored according to the prior pattern. The text names the first city to receive kingship after the flood, Kish, and it names the king, an obscure figure whose reign lasted, according to the Sumerian king list, over 1,000 years, clearly not literal, but possibly indicating a long dynastic period remembered as a single reign. What matters is the framing. Kingship is not invented by survivors figuring out how to organize themselves. It descends from heaven, from the divine realm, from the gods who, despite the flood, retain their organizational structure and now re-implement it at the human level. The implication, human governance, is not original to humanity, it is derivative. It is an implementation of the divine model. And when that implementation is disrupted by flood, by collapse, by catastrophe, it must be restored from the preserved template. Who preserves the template? The gods, specifically Enlil and the divine assembly. They hold the organizational knowledge, they maintain the system, and when the human level fails, they re-establish it. This is a very specific claim. Not that humans worship gods who then bless human efforts, but that humans operate within a system designed and maintained by higher authorities, and that when the human level of that system fails, the higher authorities restore it. Whether you take gods literally or as a metaphor for something else, preserved knowledge, prior civilization, organizational memory encoded in cultural tradition, the structure is the same. There is a template. It is maintained separately from human implementation, and it can be restored after disruption. This is not primitive thinking. This is the logic of backed-up systems, of redundancy, of constitutional continuity, even when governments fall. The flood decision demonstrates that even catastrophic action by supreme executive authority operates within institutional constraints. Enlil proposes, the assembly decides, Enki mitigates, humanity survives in reduced form, the system adapts. order is restored. And the procedure, the institutional process, the rules of deliberation, the mechanisms of authority, these persist. The system itself survives the catastrophe it authorized, because the system is not located in any one place or any one group of participants. It is procedural. It is the set of rules, the organizational framework, the mechanisms through which authority becomes operative. Enlil administers that system. The assembly authorizes decisions within it. But the system itself precedes them. And when the texts say kingship descended from heaven after the flood, they are describing the re-implementation of that system at the human level, not invented, restored, from a template that survived the catastrophe because it was preserved in the divine realm, in the Acre, in the Tablet of Destinies, in the organizational memory of the Anunnaki who continued to govern even when the human world was underwater. Consider what that implies. If human civilization is an implementation of a prior model, then studying that model, as the Sumerian scribes were taught to do, is not religious devotion. It is institutional research. It is learning the principles that make governance effective by examining the template that survived when human implementations failed. The flood narrative is not a myth about divine anger and human wickedness. It is a case study in institutional decision-making, procedural constraints on executive power, and system restoration after catastrophic disruption. And it was recorded 4,000 years ago with the kind of procedural detail that suggests the Sumerians were describing something they understood to be real, not supernatural, procedural, a system that operated according to rules, that responded to problems through institutional process, that made decisions collectively, executed them through proper authority, and adapted when outcomes differed from intent. Enlil presided over that system. He did not own it, he administered it. And when he authorized the flood, he did so through the proper channels, with the proper approvals, following the proper procedure. The system persisted. Humanity survived in reduced form. The organizational model was restored. And the texts that describe this do not present it as mythology, they present it as history, as record, as documentation of how the system works, how decisions are made, how authority is exercised, and how order is maintained across disruption. 4,000 years later, we make decisions through institutional process. We convene councils. We deliberate. We authorize action through proper channels. We face unintended consequences and adapt our policies. We maintain system continuity even when governments fall. We operate within the framework the Sumerians described, the framework they attributed to Enlil and the divine assembly, the framework they claimed descended from heaven. And whether heaven is a place or a metaphor, the framework remains, persistent, operational, structuring how authority moves through human civilization, as it has for millennia. Kingship flows from Nippur. There is a phrase that appears across hundreds of royal inscriptions from Mesopotamian history spanning over 2,000 years. It appears in Sumerian, in Akkadian, in texts from kings of Ur, Isin, Larsa, Babylon, and Assyria. The wording varies slightly, but the core is always the same. Chosen by Enlil in his holy heart for the shepherdship of the land, this is not religious flattery, this is a legal claim. A king without Enlil's selection was not legitimate, and Enlil's selection was formalized through ritual in one specific place, Nippur, in the Ikkur temple, before the divine assembly. This should seem strange. Nippur was never the largest city. It was never the military or economic capital of any empire. Kings ruled from Uruk, from Babylon, but their legitimacy came from Nippur. Why? Because Nippur was where the system authenticated authority, where divine mandate was conferred, where the proper procedure for becoming king was performed. The Sumerian king list, preserved across multiple tablets from the old Babylonian period, is explicit about this. Kingship is not an attribute of individual cities or rulers. It is a transferable authority that moves from place to place according to divine decree. The list begins, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not when the king of Eridu arose, but when kingship descended, kingship is the subject. It descends. It is given. And once given to a city, it can be transferred to another, not through conquest alone, but through divine decision. Enlil's decision. The pattern repeats throughout the list. Kingship moves from Eridu to Bad Tibira, to Larak, to Sippar, to Shuruppak. Then the flood comes, and the list states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish again, kingship descends. After catastrophic disruption, the system is restored, authority is re-established. But it is not claimed by the strongest survivor. It is granted from heaven. From where in heaven? The texts answer, from Enlil, from the assembly, from the decision made in the Eka and formalized through proper procedure. Later kings understood this. Ur-Nammu, founder of the Ur-3 dynasty around 2100 BC, left inscriptions describing how he travelled to Nippur, made offerings at the Eka, and received confirmation of his kingship from Enlil's priests. The inscription states, Enlil called Ur-Nammu by name and gave him the sceptre and royal crown. This is an installation ceremony, a formal conferral of authority, not through the king's own achievement, but through institutional recognition. Hammurabi of Babylon, 6 centuries later, begins his famous law code with the same claim, when the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, supreme power over all peoples, and made him great among the Igigi. At that time, Anu and Enlil called me, Hammurabi, by name, to bring justice to the land. Notice the structure. The gods determine supreme power. They assign it to Marduk, Tabalong's paternity, and then, within that framework, they call Hammurabi by name. The authority flows from the top down, from An and Enlil, through the divine hierarchy, to the human king. This is chain of command. This is institutional authorization. And Hammurabi does not claim kingship by conquest, though he was a conqueror. He does not claim it by lineage, though he came from a royal house. He claims it by divine selection through proper channels, because that is what made a king legitimate. The Code of Hammurabi itself is structured on this principle. It is not presented as Hammurabi's personal wisdom. It is presented as divinely authorized law, issued by a king whose authority derives from the gods. The laws are binding not because Hammurabi is powerful, but because his position is legitimate, because he was properly selected, because his authority was conferred through the system that Enlil administers. Even Assyrian kings, military emperors who ruled through force as much as law, made pilgrimage to Nippur when they could. They rebuilt the Eka. They left inscriptions claiming Enlil's favour, because without that claim, their authority was incomplete. They might hold power, but they did not hold legitimate authority. There is a difference. Power is the ability to compel action. Authority is the systemic recognition that you have the right to compel action. Power can be seized. Authority must be conferred. And in Mesopotamia, authority was conferred in Nippur by the recognition of Enlil through the proper institutional procedure. This persisted for millennia, even when Nippur was not politically dominant, even when it was controlled by foreign empires, even when the old Sumerian culture had long since been absorbed into Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian civilizations. Nippur retained its function. Kings sought legitimization there. The Ekul was maintained. The claim chosen by Enlil remained essential. Why would this particular city, this particular temple, this particular deity retain this function across such vast spans of time and political change? The conventional answer, tradition, cultural inertia, religious conservatism. But tradition for what purpose? Tradition usually persists when it serves a function, and the function here is clear: authentication of authority. Nippur was the node in the network where authority was authenticated, where the system confirmed that a king was legitimate. If we take the text seriously, if we treat them not as mythology but as description of an actual system, then Nippur served as the administrative centre of cosmic governance, the place where the divine assembly convened, the place where Enlil held court, the place where the Tablet of Destinies was kept, and where decrees were issued. And if human kingship was derivative of divine authority, then human kings needed to be formally connected to that authority. They needed to go to the place where the system was administered and receive confirmation that they were recognised within it. This is not primitive thinking. This is sophisticated organisational infrastructure. Every complex system has authentication nodes, places where credentials are verified, where authority is confirmed, where participants in the system are formally recognised. Nippur was that node for Mesopotamian kingship, and it remained functional for over 2,000 years. Consider what that implies about continuity of institutional knowledge. For an authentication system to work across that much time, the procedure must be preserved, transmitted, and consistently executed. The priests at Nippur in 2000 BC had to be performing essentially the same legitimization ritual that priests had performed in 2500 BC, and those in 1500 BC had to maintain the same procedure, and so on. This is not accidental. This is institutional continuity maintained through careful preservation of procedure. The Ekka's function was not symbolic, it was operational, and it had to be performed correctly for the system to work. Evidence for this comes from texts describing kings who tried to bypass the procedure. There are references to rulers who claimed kingship without going to Nippur, who tried to establish legitimacy through military power alone. And what happens? Their reigns are contested. Other cities refuse to recognise them. Rebellions arise. The system does not accept them. Because authority in Mesopotamia was not just about power, it was about systemic recognition. And systemic recognition required proper authentication. Enlil was not a god who needed to be pleased through offerings and flattery. He was the administrator of the authentication system. Going to Nippur was not about prayer. It was about formal installation, about connecting to the system that made kingship operational. The text describes specific elements of the procedure. The king presented offerings, not to bribe the god, but as part of the formal ritual. He approached the temple according to specific protocol. He was presented to the divine assembly, represented by the 7 major deities whose statues stood in the Ekka, and he received confirmation, likely delivered through priests interpreting omens or performing divination, but framed as Enlil's response. This is credential verification. This is the system confirming, yes, this individual is authorized to hold executive authority. Yes, their commands will be recognized as legitimate. Yes, they are now part of the chain of authority that descends from divine order. Once that confirmation was given, the king could issue decrees, make laws, command armies, and expect systemic compliance. Not because soldiers feared him personally, but because the system recognized his position as legitimate. This is the distinction between a warlord and a king. Both might command armies, but only the king's commands carry the weight of institutional legitimacy. Only the king can issue law that binds even those who opposed his rise. Only the king can claim authority that persists beyond his personal power. And in Mesopotamia, that legitimacy flowed from one source, Enlil's confirmation at Nippur. The Ur-III dynasty provides a detailed case study. 5 kings across the century 2112-2004 B maintained one of the most centralised bureaucratic administrations in ancient history, and all 5 made regular trips to Nippur, made offerings to Enlil, and left inscriptions documenting their relationship to his authority. The administration they built, complex hierarchies, specialised bureaucrats, written records for everything, was explicitly modelled on what they understood to be the divine order. Texts from the period describe earthly governance as an implementation of heavenly structure. The king executes the will of Enlil. The bureaucrats serving roles that mirror the divine hierarchy. The entire system is justified as an earthly reflection of cosmic order. This is not primitive god worship. This is organizational modeling. The Year 3 administrators studied the divine structure as described in theological texts and tried to implement it. They built a government that looked like heaven, at least heaven as the Sumerians described it. Hierarchical, bureaucratic, rule-based, with authority flowing from the top through clear chains of command. And it worked. The Year 3 state was remarkably stable and efficient. It collapsed eventually, as all states do, but not due to administrative failure. It fell to external invasion and internal rebellion, political problems, not organizational ones. The system itself was sound because it was based on a model that had been tested, refined, and preserved across millennia. A model that, according to the texts, predated human civilization, that had been established in the olden days, that Enlil administered, that descended from heaven to earth in the form of kingship. Whether you believe heaven is a literal place or a metaphor for preserved knowledge, the model remains, and it was demonstrably effective. Kingship flowed from Nippur, because Nippur was where the model was maintained, where the proper procedure was performed, where the connection between human authority and the cosmic system was formally established. And that connection mattered, not theologically, but functionally. A king connected to the system could govern effectively because his authority was recognized. A king outside the system was just a man with an army. The difference is institutional legitimacy. An institutional legitimacy was conferred in one place, by one authority, through one procedure. In Nippur, by Enlil's recognition, through the ritual of formal installation. For over 2,000 years, this was how authority worked in Mesopotamia. And then Mesopotamian civilization ended. The cities fell, the empires collapsed, the cuneiform script was forgotten, but the model persisted: divine right of kings, papal coronation, constitutional authority, the principle that legitimate rule requires higher sanction, that authority must be formally conferred, that power alone is not enough. We do not go to Nippur anymore, we do not invoke Enlil's name, but we still require authentication. We still demand that authority be properly conferred. We still distinguish between legitimate rule and mere power. We still operate within the framework that flowed from Nippur, from the Eka, from Enlil's administration, from the system that made kingship functional. And if the Sumerians were right, if they were not inventing this model, but describing it, then we are not the ones who designed this system. We inherited it from them, from the structure they recorded, from the order they claimed descended from heaven, an order that required proper authentication for authority to be legitimate, an order that still, 4,000 years later, structures how we think about power and governance, whether we realise it or not. The Sud courtship, authority through protocol. There is another story about Enlil, preserved in old Babylonian texts from around 1800 BC. It is not about cosmic administration or executive authority. It is about courtship, about how the supreme commander of the Anunnaki sought a wife. And the way the story unfolds reveals something essential about how authority was understood to function, not through force, but through proper procedure. The text is called Enlil and Sud, and it survives in fragments across multiple tablets, the most complete of which are held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature catalogues it as Composition 1.2.2, and Miguel Seville published the definitive scholarly edition in 1983. Sud was a goddess of the grain, daughter of Nisaba, the goddess of writing and scribal arts. She lived in the city of Ere, far from Nippur, and served in her mother's household. Enlil, from his temple in Nippur, heard reports of Sud's beauty and wisdom. The text is specific. He did not simply see her and desire her. He made inquiries. He gathered information. He learned about her character, her family, her status. This is due diligence. When Enlil decided to pursue Sud as a wife, he did not send a command. He sent a marriage proposal through proper channels to her parents, with gifts appropriate to her station. The text describes this in detail. Enlil loaded up precious stones, silver and gold. He sent them to Ere, to Sud's mother Nisaba. He sent his vizier Nuska as his representative to speak on his behalf. This is formal courtship following established protocol. There is a procedure for how a marriage proposal should be made. Enlil, despite being the supreme executive of the cosmos, follows that procedure. He does not bypass it. He does not use his authority to compel. He operates within the system. Sud's mother receives the proposal and the gifts. The text describes her examining them, considering their quality, evaluating whether they are appropriate. Then she consults with Sud. She does not decide for her daughter. She presents the offer and asks for Sud's response. Sud considers. She evaluates Enlil not primarily on his power, but on whether he followed correct procedure. The text has her saying, he has done everything correctly. He has shown proper respect. He has made the appropriate offerings. He has followed the customs. This is compatibility evaluation based on procedural compliance. Sud is assessing whether Enlil understands how to operate within social structures, whether he respects institutional norms, whether he will be a partner who honours the rules that govern relationships. She agrees to the marriage. But the courtship is not complete. There are additional steps. Enlil must travel to Ere in person. He must formally request permission from Sud's father, Nisaba's husband. The text names him as higher, though he plays a minor role. He must present himself for inspection. He must demonstrate that he is who his representatives claimed he was. The text describes this journey with attention to detail that seems excessive if this were merely mythology. Enlil prepares, he brings additional gifts, he travels with an entourage appropriate to his station, he arrives at the appointed time, he presents himself according to the customs of formal courtship, and Sud's family evaluates him. They judge whether his conduct matches the proposal, whether he is suitable, whether the marriage should proceed. Eventually, they approve. The formal betrothal is announced. A date is set for the wedding. And only then, only after all proper procedures have been followed, all approvals obtained, all customs observed, does the marriage take place. The text culminates in a wedding celebration where Sud receives a new name, Ninlil, Lady of the Wind, reflecting her new status as Enlil's consort. She is elevated to queenship of the pantheon. She becomes co-administrator of the cosmic order alongside her husband. And the texts that follow treat Ninlil as having real authority. She is not simply Enlil's wife. She is his partner in governance. She holds her own powers. She administers her own domains. The marriage did not subsume her identity. It formalized a partnership between equals. This is sophisticated relationship structure for texts dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE. But what matters most is not the relationship itself. What matters is that Enlil, the supreme authority, the one whose word is unchangeable when properly decreed, voluntarily submitted to a social procedure that constrained his behaviour. He could not simply take Sud. He had to ask. He had to gain permission. He had to follow the rules. And the text treats this as proper, as the correct way for even supreme authority to act. Power does not grant the right to bypass procedure. Authority operates within frameworks. Even the administrator of cosmic order must observe the protocols of social organisation. This is rule of law consciousness. Now contrast this with another story about Enlil and Ninlil, a different myth, darker in tone, that describes what happened before the courtship of Sud. That myth, preserved in multiple old Babylonian sources and catalogued in the electronic text corpus as Composition 1.2.1, describes an earlier encounter between Enlil and the goddess who would become his wife. In that version, Ninlil is young, bathing in a river near Nippur. Enlil sees her and is overcome with desire. He approaches her. She refuses him, and the text is explicit. He rapes her. The language is not metaphorical. The Sumerian term is clear. Scholars have analysed it extensively. Julia Sante published a detailed study in 1998 titled Why It Was Rape, examining how the text leaves no ambiguity about the non-consensual nature of the act. And what happens next is critical. The divine assembly convenes. Enlil is charged with a crime. He is put on trial. And despite being the supreme executive, despite administering the cosmic order, he is found guilty and sentenced to exile in the underworld. Enlil does not contest the judgment. He does not use his authority to overturn it. He accepts the sentence and departs for the underworld to serve his punishment. This is accountability of executive authority to institutional law. The myth continues with Ninlil following Enlil into the underworld. She is pregnant with his child, the moon god Nana, and she refuses to be separated from the father of her child despite his crime. The narrative becomes complex, involving Enlil taking multiple forms and fathering additional children with Ninlil in the underworld. Scholars debate the symbolism, but what is structurally clear is that Enlil's exile is treated as real, as binding, as a consequence he cannot evade, even though he is the supreme god. Eventually, Enlil is allowed to return from exile. His sentence is served. He is restored to his position. And it is after this restoration, after he has been held accountable, punished, and rehabilitated, that the formal courtship of Sud occurs. The sequence matters. The rape myth describes what happens when even supreme authority acts outside the bounds of law. Consequences follow. The system holds him accountable. He is punished. And only after that punishment is complete, only after he has demonstrated that he understands and accepts the rules, is he allowed to properly court and marry Ninlil according to the correct procedure. The Sud courtship in this reading is not just a love story. It is a demonstration that Enlil has learned to operate within the system rather than above it, that he understands authority is bounded by law, that even the administrator of cosmic order must observe the procedures that structure social relationships. This is extraordinary. The Sumerians articulated a mythology in which their supreme deity commits a crime, is held accountable, is punished, and then must prove through correct behaviour that he can be trusted with authority again. They did not sanitize their executive. They did not present him as infallible. They presented him as subject to the same laws that governed everyone else. This is not how kings typically describe themselves. Kings claim divine right, absolute authority, freedom from accountability, but the Sumerians described their divine executive as bounded by law, accountable to the assembly, subject to consequences when he violated the rules. And then they told human kings, you are chosen by Enlil, you hold authority derived from his, and like him, you are subject to law. Your authority is legitimate only when you operate within proper procedure. This is constitutional thinking in mythological form. The Sud courtship narrative was not just a story, it was a teaching. It instructed those who studied it on how authority should be exercised, through respect for procedure, through proper protocol, through recognition that even supreme power must operate within frameworks that constrain behaviour. Enlil courts Sud correctly. He follows every step. He respects every custom. He does not use his position to bypass the process. And the result is a legitimate marriage, a partnership of equals, a union that strengthens rather than violates the cosmic order. This is the model. This is what kings were meant to emulate. Authority exercised through proper procedure. Power constrained by law. Recognition that legitimacy comes not from force, but from operating correctly within the system. 4,000 years later, we still teach this principle. We still insist that authority must be properly exercised. We still hold leaders accountable when they violate the rules. We still distinguish between legitimate authority and abuse of power. We still operate within the framework the Sud courtship illustrates, a framework where even the supreme executive must follow procedure to be legitimate, where consent matters, where protocol constrains power, where the system is stronger than any individual participant. The Sumerians encoded this in a story about courtship, about how Enlil, administrator of cosmic order, sought a wife according to the proper customs, and thereby demonstrated that authority operates through respect for structure, not through force. Whether Enlil was a literal deity or a personification of executive principle, the teaching remains. Authority must be properly exercised. Procedure must be followed. The system constrains even supreme power, and that constraint is not weakness. It is what makes authority legitimate, what makes power sustainable, what makes governance just. The Sud courtship is a template for how authority should operate, with respect, with procedure, with recognition that power without legitimacy is merely force, and force without constraint inevitably becomes tyranny. Enlil followed the procedure, he courted correctly, he married legitimately, and the texts hold him up not despite this constraint, but because of it. His legitimacy was proven through his willingness to operate within the system rather than above it. Ninurta's inheritance, the commander's son. Enlil had children. Several sons appear in Sumerian texts, but the most prominent, the one who most clearly inherits aspects of his father's executive authority, is Ninurta, god of war, agriculture, and storms. The texts describe him as Enlil's foremost son, the warrior of Enlil, the strong arm of his father. But Ninurta does not simply inherit authority because of his lineage. He earns it. And the myth that demonstrates this, the myth of Anzu that we touched on earlier, reveals something important about how succession worked in the Sumerian organizational model. Authority was not automatically hereditary. It was meritocratic. The Anzu myth describes a crisis. The tablet of destinies has been stolen from Enlil's temple. Cosmic order has stalled. The gods convene an emergency assembly, and Enlil cannot act himself because his authority operates through the tablet. Without it, he cannot issue binding decrees. The mechanism has been decoupled from the office. The system is locked. Enlil addresses the assembly and asks for volunteers. Someone must confront Anzu, recover the tablet, and restore order. But whoever accepts this task faces extraordinary danger. They will be confronting someone who holds the tablet, who can decree their defeat, who wields, temporarily and illegitimately, but still functionally, the supreme executive power. The first gods Enlil asks refuse. The text names them. Adad refuses, Jera refuses, Shara refuses. Each declines with the same reasoning. Anzu holds the tablet. Whoever confronts him will be facing someone who can alter fate itself. This is risk assessment. These are capable gods evaluating a mission and determining that the odds are unacceptable. They are not cowards. They are being rational. But Ninurta accepts. Why? The text does not fully explain his motivation, but it implies two factors. First, Ninurta is Enlil's son. There is a family obligation. More importantly, though, the text suggests Ninurta understands something the others do not. The tablet's power is procedural, not intrinsic. Anzu holds the mechanism, but he does not hold the legitimate authority. There is a mismatch, and if that mismatch can be exploited, the tablet can be recovered. Ninurta's first attempts fail. He confronts Anzu directly. He shoots arrows. Anzu decrees them turned back. He calls storms. Anzu decrees them dispersed. As long as Anzu holds the tablet and can issue decrees through it, Ninurta cannot overcome him through force. So Ninurta requests guidance. He goes to Enki, god of wisdom, and Enki provides the key insight, target, not Anzu himself, but the mechanism that allows Anzu to hold the tablet. Sever the flight feathers. Break Anzu's grip. Separate the illegitimate holder from the mechanism. Ninurta follows this strategy. He uses precision rather than force. He targets the specific vulnerability, and it works. Anzu falls. The tablet is dislodged. Ninurta catches it before it can be damaged. And then, this is critical, Ninurta immediately returns the tablet to Enlil. He does not keep it. He does not claim that having recovered it, he now has the right to wield it. He recognizes that the tablet's power is procedural, that it functions only when held by legitimate authority, that he has not earned that legitimacy simply by recovering the mechanism. He returns it to his father. He restores the proper order. He re-establishes the connection between legitimate office and operational mechanism. And for this, for recovering the tablet, and for respecting the proper procedure of returning it, Ninurta is rewarded. The assembly praises him. Enlil grants him titles and authorities. He is elevated in status within the divine hierarchy. He becomes recognized as the one who will execute Enlil's will, the warrior arm of executive authority. This is earned succession. Ninurta proved himself not through lineage, but through competence, courage, and, most importantly, through respect for proper procedure. He did not use the crisis as an opportunity to seize power. He used it to demonstrate that he understood how power should be exercised in service to the system, not in exploitation of it. The texts that follow describe Ninurta as acting increasingly as Enlil's representative. When Enlil decrees that something must be done, Ninurta is the one who executes the decree. He becomes the operational arm of executive authority, the one who implements decisions, the enforcer of cosmic order. But he is not independent. He does not act on his own authority. He acts as agent of his father's authority. And the texts are clear that this is a proper relationship. The executive delegates specific authorities to trusted subordinates who carry out policy while respecting the chain of command. This is organizational structure. This is how complex administrations actually work. The supreme executive cannot do everything personally. Authority must be delegated. But delegation requires trust that the subordinate will act in accordance with the executive's intent and within the bounds of proper procedure. Ninurta demonstrates that he can be trusted. He recovers the tablet, the crisis that threatened to collapse cosmic order, and rather than exploiting the opportunity, he restores the proper structure. He proves his competence and his loyalty simultaneously, and for that he becomes heir, not automatically, not through birth, through merit demonstrated in crisis. This is a template for succession that appears throughout history. The capable subordinate who proves themselves during emergency, the trusted deputy who respects the system even when they could exploit it, the heir who earns the right to inherit through demonstrated competence and procedural propriety. The Sumerians encoded this in the Ninurta narrative, and human kings took note. Succession in Mesopotamian dynasties was not purely hereditary in the early periods. Kings often elevated the most competent son, or even adopted capable administrators as heirs. The principle was that authority should pass to those who had demonstrated they could exercise it properly. Later dynasties became more strictly hereditary, but even then the ideal remained. The heir should prove themselves competent before assuming full authority. They should serve in administrative roles, lead military campaigns, demonstrate that they understood how to operate within the system. The Ninurta template persisted because it articulated something true about how succession works in complex organizations. Competence matters, loyalty to the system matters, respect for procedure matters, and these qualities must be demonstrated, not assumed. Ninurta became Enlil's strong arm, not because he was born to it, but because he earned it by recovering the Tablet of Destinies and immediately returning it to proper authority. By proving he understood that authority is not something to be seized, but something to be properly exercised within legitimate frameworks. This is the model of succession the Sumerians preserved. Meritocratic within hierarchical structure, respectful of lineage but not bound by it, requiring demonstration of competence and procedural propriety before authority is transferred. And it worked. The Sumerian organisational model persisted across millennia, partly because succession was handled this way. Authority passed to those who had proven they could exercise it properly. The system was maintained across generations, not through blind heredity, but through cultivated competence. Ninurta earned his inheritance, and in doing so he provided a template for how authority should transfer across time while maintaining the integrity of the system that authority serves. The Ur-3 experiment, divine bureaucracy on Earth. Around 2112 Bake, a king named Ur-Nammu established a dynasty in the city of Ur that would become one of the most administratively sophisticated governments in ancient history. The Ur-3 state lasted just over a century, 5 kings, ending in 2004 BCE, but in that time it created a bureaucratic system so detailed, so thoroughly documented, that we have over 100,000 administrative tablets from this period alone. This was not mythology, this was implementation. The Ur-3 state was an explicit attempt to create on Ur what the Sumerians described in heaven, a hierarchical, rule-based, thoroughly administered order that operated through written decrees, proper procedures, and clear chains of command. And they credited the model to Enlil. Ur-Nammu's inscriptions are explicit about this. One text, preserved on a foundation stone from the Ekkur temple reconstruction, reads, "When Enlil, king of all lands, gave the kingship of Sumer and Akkad to Ur-Nammu, he decreed a fate of well-being for the land." Another inscription states, "By the righteous commands of Enlil, Ur-Nammu made justice prevail in the land." This is not religious piety, this is constitutional framing. Ur-Nammu is claiming that his authority derives from Enlil, that his administration implements Enlil's decrees, that the organisational structure he is building reflects divine order. And what did that structure look like? The archaeological record shows a centralised state with a complex administrative hierarchy. At the top was the king. Below him were provincial governors called Ensi, each administering a major city and its surrounding territory. Below the governors were temple administrators, military commanders, and specialised bureaucrats managing everything from agriculture to textile production to livestock management. Every transaction was recorded. Every allocation of resources was documented. Every worker was assigned to a specific role with specific outputs expected. The tablets that survive show daily records of grain distributions, work assignments, tool allocations, livestock counts. The system tracked everything. This is the bureaucratic state in its earliest full form, not emerging organically from increasing complexity, but implemented deliberately according to a model. A model, the texts say, came from Enlil, from the divine administration, from the way order was maintained in the cosmic realm. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known law code, begins with the same framing. When the god Nana selected Ur-Nammu to rule over Ur and Sumer, by the righteous commands of Utu, I established justice in the land. Divine selection, divine commands, justice as implementation of higher order. The laws themselves are structured as royal decrees. If a man does X, then Y shall be the consequence. This is procedural law, not principles, but specific rules, not wisdom, but code. If then statements that can be consistently applied across the entire administration. This is rule of law in written, enforceable form. Not arbitrary royal judgment, but codified procedure that even the king is bound to follow once he has decreed it, because a properly issued decree becomes part of the system, and the system constrains all participants. The Ur-3 administration also created standardized weights and measures, standardized calendar, standardized administrative terminology. Everything was designed to be consistent across the entire state. A grain measurement in Ur meant the same thing as a grain measurement in Nippur or Uruk. An administrative title carried the same authority regardless of location. This is systems thinking. This is the deliberate creation of infrastructure that allows complex organisation to function at scale. And the bureaucrats who operated this system were trained in scribal schools where they studied not just how to write cuneiform, but how administration worked. They copied texts describing divine governance. They learned the organizational hierarchy of the gods. They studied the procedures through which Enlil administered cosmic order. Because they were being trained to implement that model at the human level, a Sumerian text called the Instructions of Uruppak, one of the oldest wisdom compositions, contains advice from father to son on how to succeed in administration. And embedded in that advice is this principle: study the divine order. Understand how the gods maintain the universe. For the scribe who knows how heaven is organized can organize earth. This is not metaphorical. This is instructional. The divine model was studied as a template for human governance. The bureaucrats believed they were implementing a system that had been proven effective at the cosmic level. Did it work? By the standards of ancient administration, remarkably well. The Earth-3 state fed its population, maintained infrastructure, funded large building projects, supported specialized craftsmen, and operated a standing military. It did all of this without modern technology, without rapid communication, without computers or databases. It did it with clay tablets, with trained scribes, with a hierarchical system that everyone understood, with written procedures that were consistently followed, with an organizational model that had been articulated clearly enough that it could be implemented across a large territory and sustained for over a century. The system eventually collapsed, invaded by Elamites from the east, weakened by internal strains, but it collapsed politically, not administratively. The bureaucratic infrastructure continued to function under new rulers. The model persisted even when the dynasty fell. Because the model was not Earth-3's invention, it was their implementation of something older, something they believed had been established by Enlil, something that predated their state and would survive it. The tablets from this period show bureaucrats referring to divine precedent when establishing new procedures. According to the decree of Enlil, following the example of the Akur, as was done in the olden days, these references appear in administrative texts dealing with entirely practical matters: grain allocation, worker assignments, festival scheduling. The divine order was not just ideology, it was operational guidance. It was the manual they consulted when building their administration, and the result was one of the most effective pre-modern states in history. A government that functioned through written law, trained administrators, clear procedures, and consistent execution of policy across a large territory. The Earth-3 experiment demonstrated that the Sumerian organizational model, the model they attributed to Enlil and the Divine Assembly, was not just mythological ideal. It was implementable. It worked. It could structure human society effectively if properly applied. And when it worked, it looked exactly like what the theological text described: hierarchical, rule-based, thoroughly administered, with authority flowing from the top through clear chains of command and decisions executed through proper procedure. The gods governed through order. The Earth-3 state tried to govern through the same order, and for a century it succeeded. The lesson was not lost on subsequent civilizations. Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian empires all studied Sumerian administrative texts. All implemented bureaucratic systems modelled on the hierarchical, rule-based structure the Sumerians had articulated. All claimed divine sanction for their authority. The model propagated, not through conquest alone, but through demonstrated effectiveness. Bureaucratic administration worked better than chaotic personal rule. Written law worked better than arbitrary judgment. Clear hierarchies worked better than contested authority. The system the Sumerians attributed to Enlil proved superior to alternatives, and so it spread, and 4,000 years later we still structure governments this way: hierarchical authority, written law, trained administrators, clear procedures, systemic rather than personal rule. We call it bureaucracy. We sometimes resent its inflexibility, its impersonality, its procedural requirements. But it works. It allows complex societies to function. It creates order from potential chaos. It makes governance consistent across large populations. And its earliest full implementation was the Year 3 state, which explicitly claimed to be building on Earth what Enlil had established in heaven, a system, an order, a way of organising authority so that it functions effectively, consistently, justly. Whether Enlil designed it or the Sumerians invented it and attributed it to him, the system remains, and we still live inside it, still following procedures, still operating within hierarchies, still subject to written law, still participants in an organisational structure that feels permanent, natural, inevitable, because it has been running for 4,000 years. Since the Year 3 experiment proved it could work, since the Sumerians demonstrated that divine order could be implemented on Earth, since they built a state according to the template they claimed descended from heaven, and the template has been running ever since. The questions that remain. The clay is cool again. You are back in the museum basement, or in your own quiet space, wherever you found to contemplate these questions. The tablets have been examined, the texts have been read, the organisational structure has been laid out in detail, and now the question that has hovered at the edge of every chapter finally settles into focus. What does it mean? What does it mean that the Sumerians, at the dawn of written history, articulated a model of governance so sophisticated that we still use its basic architecture? What does it mean that they attributed this model not to human invention, but to divine order? What does it mean that they describe themselves not as creating civilization, but as restoring it, rebuilding it, preserving knowledge that had survived some great catastrophe? 3 interpretations have shadowed this investigation from the beginning. Each has merit. Each explains some, but not all, of what the texts contain. The first interpretation, pure mythology. The Sumerians were early humans trying to make sense of their world, and they created stories about gods to explain natural phenomena and social structures. Enlil is a personification of wind and authority. The divine assembly is a projection of human political organisation. The tablet of destinies is a metaphor for fate. The entire cosmology is folklore, valuable for understanding Sumerian culture, but not literally true. This interpretation accounts for most of the evidence. Humans do create gods. We do project our social structures onto the cosmos. We do use mythology to explain our world, but it struggles with specific details. Why would the Sumerians project a governmental system more sophisticated than their own? Why would they describe the divine order as predating human civilization if they were inventing it to explain their present? Why would they insist repeatedly that they were restoring rather than creating? The second interpretation, encoded wisdom. The Sumerian texts preserve sophisticated philosophical and organizational insights encoded in narrative form. Enlil represents executive principle. The divine assembly represents deliberative governance. The tablet of destinies represents constitutional mechanism. The myths are teaching stories that preserve genuine knowledge about how authority, hierarchy, and social order function. This interpretation accounts for the sophistication. Ancient peoples were not primitive. They understood psychology, politics, and social dynamics. And encoding knowledge in narrative made it memorable, transmissible across generations without writing, resistant to corruption. But it struggles with the procedural specificity. Teaching stories are usually simpler. They focus on clear moral lessons. The Sumerian material is often bureaucratic, filled with administrative detail that does not serve obvious pedagogical purpose. Why describe the exact procedure for convening divine assembly if the point is just to teach that deliberation is important? The third interpretation, historical preservation. The Sumerians were documenting an actual organizational system that existed before their civilization. Not supernatural gods, but something else. A prior advanced culture, a lost civilization, a pre-flood society that had developed sophisticated governance and whose descendants preserved the knowledge of how it worked. Enlil was not a deity, but an office, an administrator, or the personification of the executive function within that system. The texts are not mythology, but organizational memory. This interpretation accounts for the specificity, the consistency, the insistence on restoration rather than invention. It explains why the Sumerians studied their theological texts as administrative guidance, because they believed those texts preserved actual knowledge from an earlier, more advanced time. But it requires accepting something extraordinary, that a sophisticated civilization existed before the Sumerians, left no material trace beyond what the Sumerians recorded, and was completely destroyed in some catastrophe that the Sumerians called the Flood. That is a large claim requiring substantial evidence, and the archaeological record does not clearly support it. So we are left with three interpretations, none fully satisfying. Or perhaps the truth is not singular. Perhaps all three are partially correct. Perhaps the Sumerians preserved organizational knowledge from an earlier culture, encoded it in mythological narrative to ensure its transmission, and genuinely believed they were documenting a divine order that had existed before human civilization. Perhaps Enlil was both God and organizational principle, both supernatural authority and the personification of executive function, both mythological figure and preserved memory of how governance was actually structured in the time before. The texts allow this ambiguity. They do not resolve cleanly into any single interpretation, and perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps the ambiguity itself is the point, multiple layers of meaning preserved simultaneously so that the knowledge survives even if the original context is lost. What we can say with certainty is this: the Sumerians articulated a model of governance that has structured human civilization for 4,000 years. Hierarchical authority, written law, deliberative councils, executive power constrained by procedure, authority requiring proper sanction, decisions implemented through clear chains of command. These are not inevitable features of human organization. Other models exist. Other structures are possible. But this specific model, the one the Sumerians attributed to Enlil, proved more effective than alternatives. It spread, it persisted, it adapted to new contexts while maintaining its basic architecture. We live inside it now. Every government, every corporation, every complex organization you participate in operates according to these principles. Authority flows from the top. Decisions require proper authorization. Rules constrain behavior. Written records make commitments binding. Hierarchies distribute responsibilities. You accept this as natural because you were born into it. But it is not natural. It is designed. And the question that remains is whether we designed it or whether we inherited it from designers whose names we have forgotten. The Sumerians credited Enlil. They described him as administering a system that predated their civilization. They built their governments as implementations of his cosmic order, and those governments worked. The model was effective. Whether Enlil was God, principle, office, or memory of actual administrators from before the flood, the system he represents remains operational, still structuring authority, still organizing societies, still running 4,000 years, countless dynasties, empires risen and fallen, languages forgotten and rediscovered, and through it all, the basic architecture persists, the framework holds. Enlil's influence, if we can call it that, is not supernatural, it is structural. It is in how we organize everything, in the hierarchies we accept as necessary, in the procedures we follow without questioning, in the systems we inhabit so completely that we cannot imagine alternatives. You work within hierarchies, you follow rules, you accept that properly authorized decisions are binding, you recognize the distinction between legitimate authority and mere power. you understand that complex societies require organised administration. All of this, every bit of it, was first articulated in texts describing Enlil's governance, in Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets 4,000 years ago. Did the Sumerians invent it, or did they preserve it? The question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, but the effect is the same. The model exists. It structures your life. It shapes how you think about authority, legitimacy, organisation and order. Enlil's influence persists not because anyone worships him, but because the system he represented, whether divine, philosophical or historical, proved more effective than alternatives. And so it propagated, generation after generation, civilization after civilization. We are not ruled by ancient gods, but we are governed by ancient principles, principles that were fully articulated, completely operational in the earliest civilization we can read. And those principles, the texts say, descended from heaven, from the divine assembly, from Enlil's administration in the Acre at Nippur, from a time before when kingship first existed and order was established and the system began to run. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, the structure remains, the architecture holds, the system continues, and you, wherever you are, whatever hierarchies you navigate, whatever authorities you answer to, whatever rules constrain your behaviour, you live within that ancient framework. Following procedures established thousands of years ago, operating within organisational logic that predates every government you recognise. The questions remain. Who designed this? Where did it come from? How did the Sumerians know to build their civilization this way? But one thing is not a question. One thing is simply observation. The system works. It structures civilization. It has persisted longer than any empire, any religion, any ideology, and at its root, in its earliest articulation, there is Enlil, the administrator, the decreer of fates, the one whose word was unchangeable when properly issued, the executive authority of cosmic order, still present, not in temples or prayers, but in structure, in organisation, in the invisible architecture of how authority moves through the world. Whether he was God or principle, administrator or organisational memory, his influence remains. In every hierarchy you navigate, in every rule you follow, in every system you inhabit, descended from heaven, the texts say, preserved through catastrophe, restored when the waters receded, and kingship descended once, and running, still running, 4,000 years later, structuring everything, organising civilization itself according to patterns established in the olden days. The Anunnaki commander, the executive of cosmic order, the one who decreed fates, Enlil, his system remains, and we still live inside it.